Hello friends, and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to show you this amazing tool in Houdini, which is the Vellum Brush. It's going to help you to art direct cloth simulations and making any kind of adjustments that you need to match concept design or feedback that you get from the client or an art director, for example. Now, what I'm going to show you are production techniques that I use on the studio that I'm working currently. And if you work in a professional environment, you know how important it is not only to be as fast, as efficient as possible, but also being able to implement the feedback that you're going to get. Now, when you are doing a cloth simulation, obviously you have those basic simulations that you can do very easily, like a flag or a banner. But when you have something a little bit more complex that require you folding the fabric on top of the other folds, it can become a little bit difficult if you're just using the basic tools that you get on most DCCs. Usually in the past, what I would do is animating constraints and trying my best, but you know how difficult it is to implement feedback once the simulation is done. Hopefully by the end of this tutorial you see how practical the Vellum Brush it is. I'm going to show you not step by step and showing all the settings. That's a topic for a masterclass. What I'm going to show instead is just like the key aspects you need to pay attention, and then on your own time you can discover a little bit better like all the different settings and what they do. Now before we start, I just want to mention that you can get this Houdini file on my ArtStation. This includes some of the notes. You can see the settings that I use, and I also wrote a couple of notes detailing the different steps you need to use. So if you want, you can check my ArtStation and get the file there. Okay, so starting with the geometry, most of the times you are going to use something like this, a grid or a plane. And then at this stage, you have actually two options. Most of the times, the best option is definitely using the remesh tool. This is going to provide the best results. Simulation is going to run a little bit smoother. You're going to have better details, the folds, the crease, they're going to look sharper. However, there are situations where you're not able to use topology like this and you need perfect quads. So it's completely fine to subdivide. This will also work, but you have to keep in mind that it's going to be a little bit more difficult to work with this type of geometry. Also, you have to try to find a balance in terms of how dense the topology is going to be. You don't want to go overboard because otherwise the simulation is going to be super slow. So it's trying to find the right balance. But in both situations are valid. Obviously, the remesh is going to provide better results. Then the next step is the collisions that you need. Most of the times, if possible, I try to use VDBs. There are situations where this is not possible because somewhere in the geometry is open. You also don't have the time to go and just close the geometry perfectly. So using just geometry without being VDB is completely fine. The only thing that I would say you have to be careful is try to avoid sharp corners like the ones you see here. Something like this, it's going to make the simulation really difficult. You're going to have intersections and you're going to spend a lot of time trying to fix those. So whatever possible, avoid these, and just to be safe at the bevel, just to make sure you don't have any sharp corners. That is in terms of collision. Now the other step is starting to define your constraints. There is different ways you can do that. You can use a group like I'm using here, and in this case using a box, I'm making this selection. This is one way you can create those constraints or pins. The other way you can do it is inside the vellum cloth. You have this section here where you can select the pinpoints. So if I go to this one and if I select the cursor, you can see that I selected these points here and these points over there. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind is if you are defining these pinpoints or these constraints at this level, those constraints are going to be carry on then down the stream. So if I go to the Vellum Brush and if I try to move this section here where the pins are already there, you are not going to be able to do that. So just something to keep in mind. So then the next step is adding a vellum cloth. So if you press the tab key and you type vellum cloth, you're going to find this. Now, like I mentioned, this is not a masterclass. I can obviously go through all these settings and explain what they do, but what I can highlight is definitely three key areas that's going to make a difference between the fabric or the cloth you're simulating look to something like silk or going to look like leather. The key things to keep in mind is the density. So this is going to define how heavy the fabric is. And then the other two is the stretch and the bend. So the stretch is how much the fabric is going to stretch, and the bend, how flexible the material is, let's say that's where. So these are the three key areas you'll have to keep in mind. One thing that I recommend is definitely just do a couple of tests to see what feels right. Now, something that you can find on this WIF file is a link to this website, the side effects tutorials, where there is some settings for the cloth, so you can see here, and it gives you a little bit more information in terms of how it works. This is for the vellum cloth. Now, at this stage, you have two options, as you can see here. So the first option is letting the Vellum Solver to do the heavy lifting for us. And then once you're happy with the initial simulation, you can just connect the Vellum Brush and go from there. And then the second option is just completely ignore the Vellum Solver and you just connect the Vellum Brush directly to the Vellum cloth. So when do you want to use the first option? When you want to use the second option? So usually I use the first option when I have to simulate a very big piece of cloth. And instead of just using the Vellum brush, which by all means you can still use it, I find it faster and easier to see the results with using a Vellum Solver. So that's when I use the first option, when I'm looking with a very big asset. The Vellum brush as a second option, that's when I'm working with a smaller piece of cloth. So I don't need to use a Vellum Solver to do the heavy lifting for me, and I can just go straight away and start doing the adjustments. So that's the difference between the two options. So let's have a better look on the first option. Here we are using a Vellum Solver. This is what is going to make the simulation for us. And one of the things I want to highlight is the steps and the constraint iterations. These two settings, it's what's going to define how your simulation is going to be. So the more sub-steps and the more constraint iterations you have, the better the simulation is going to look, but at the same time, the longer it will take to calculate. Now, one of the things I want to highlight is there is a massive difference between using a sub-step of 1 and a sub-step of 4. And I'm going to show you that, and by the magic of editing, you'll see the result of using 4 sub-steps and using 1. Okay, so we are back, and you can see here, this is the first simulation that I did. The settings that I'm using, sub-steps 4, constraint iterations 200, and now the second Vellum Solver that I have, I'm actually using the default settings you have, so sub-steps of 1 and constraint iterations of 100. Now, if you compare what you get with the, let's say, higher quality with a lower quality, this is what I mean by a massive difference, as you can see. So something to keep in mind when you do your initial simulation is it's fine if you use the sub-steps of 1 and lower constraint iteration just to see if everything is working fine, the constraints are working fine. But then once you want to start to get serious, it's time for you to start increasing these settings. Then the next thing that you need is this Vellum IO. This will work similar to what happens with the file cache. Now the big difference is it will save not only the geometry, but as you can see, also save the constraints, and it will save any collisions that you have. So what I do is I will set up this Vellum IO, and then I will click this option here, load from disk, and then here to start, and I'll just define how long I want the simulation and press save to disk. Then once I'm happy with, for example, if I go back here and select it, once I'm happy with, let's say, this frame 100, that's when I'm going to use the Vellum Brush. Now, what you want to do is you want to drop a Vellum Brush, and before doing anything, there are 2 important things you'll have to do. First of all is make sure you select this option to input frame and then input the frame that you want. In my case is 100. And then before you do any kind of work, you want to click on this option here, set rest state. If you don't do this, and if you start to make adjustments to the cloth, the first thing will happen, all of this will start to stretch back to the initial position, and you'll have to wait for the simulation inside the Vellum brush to again simulate everything. So with the Vellum brush, it's where all the fun starts. And if you don't see anything on your screen, once you select this node, you can click this icon here to get the gizmo. And as you can see, this is super simple. You'll get some hints here explaining how the tool works. And then if you do a right click, this is where you can have like a quick menu to select, for example, how you're going to select the geometry. Most of the times I'm using surface, and then you have the different modes. Initially, you are going to work perhaps with the drag and the brush, and then on a later stage, you're going to use these different options, the contract, rotate, crease, ruffle, and collisions, to just refine the simulation a little bit. But initially, the stage, you're going to use surface and drag. And then the other thing you'll have to keep in mind is in terms of simulation modes, you have two modes. The easiest ways to remind these modes is you have the static mode and I have the live mode. So the static mode means, for example, I have the drag option here. It means you can select a piece of cloth, right? And then you can start dragging the cloth to whatever you want, okay? So this is the let's say the static mode, or as you can see, he enforces the damped mode. So if I go back to my tool and I do reset all changes, set rest state, now let's see the other option. So the other option is if you press the G key, as you can see here, G for simulation mode, this goes to settle mode. Now this will start doing simulation in real time. And the cool thing is you can start holding and pulling things around, and you are simulating in real time. So this is like the two different options. Now, the way that I work is initially I'll be working in live simulation mode, and then once I'm happy, I can stop the simulation, for example, and let's say I want to go and just drag this element here a little bit more, for example, to put it in position, and then start the simulation from here. So it's like a back and forth from the different simulations. I can show you very briefly how you can work with this tool, with the Vellum brush, just to get things in position. So like I mentioned, reset all change, set red state, and now I'm going to use the drag. So if I press the G key, we are starting the live simulation. So I'm going to grab this element here, and I'm going to pull it here. Now, if you release the mouse, the left button, this is live simulation, so it'll just start to fall, okay? So you need to keep that in mind. So what I do is, I will, let's say with this camera angle, put it roughly in the position that I want, let it settle a little bit, and then I press the G key, okay? So this will freeze the simulation. I rotate my camera, my viewport, again. Now, a trick that you can do is, before you press the G key, click and hold, left click and hold to select that region, and then if you press the G key, it's going to get stuck there, and then you can move on to the correct position. So let's say something like this here. So if I press G again get static, okay, cool, that's what I want. Now obviously it's going to be impossible to be holding these forever, because if you want to work on a different place, you need a way to get this in the correct position. So what you can do is, and you can see here the hints, if you press the shift key and if you use your middle mouse button or the wheel, and if you start to paint, you can paint some pins here. So now if I press the G key, you can see like this is going to be static and everything else is available for you to move. The other cool thing is, even in the live simulation modes or in the dampened mode, if you hover this region here with the pins, and if you press with the middle mouse button or the wheel, you can actually use this as a selection to move it to a new location. So very easily, you can start moving the cloth around and making the adjustments that you need to match, the feedback that you're getting, or to match the concept design. So can now move to a different location, for example. Let's say I want to move all of these up, so I can, with a wheel on my mouse, I can just increase the gizmo size, and then I can start holding this section here and moving up. Let it settle a little bit. Obviously, you're simulating in real time, and then once you're happy, you can press the G key to stop. And then similar to what we did, we can just paint some pins, and then this is going to be held in place, right? Obviously, there is a lot of back and forth between the different modes, but that's roughly the workflow that you'll have. You move something into place, you let it settle, you adjust it, and then a lot of times I'll just go here to specific regions and starting dragging. Now, you want to work into different stage. Like, your initial stage is just get the shape, the initial shape in position, because then you can connect a different vellum brush and make refinements. Because one of the things I wanted to draw attention is to this section here, the quality. So similar to what happened with the Vellum Solver, you can actually increase the quality of the simulation that you're getting with the Vellum brush. So the same principle applies. Higher sub-steps are going to increase the quality, and lower sub-steps is going to decrease. So you can see the difference of changing between the settle and the damped versions. They're going to change the sub-steps, so that's something you'll have to keep in mind. So a lot of times I will just do the initial shape, and then if I want, I can go in the simulation mode damped. I'll just use something like the drag and just move things into a different location. And move something like, let's say, to this location. And then once you're happy, right, similar what we did there, we can do the shift middle mouse button to hold that, and then if you press G, it will try to settle and take into account the changes that you did. Okay, so let's say this is the final shape that you want. Before we move to the next node, just to remind something I mentioned initially, is the fact that we have those pins that we defined initially on our vellum cloth here. So that means in the vellum brush, even if I click and try to drag, this is not going to move, right? So because you still have the pins there. So that's something you'll have to keep in mind. But once you are happy with the simulation the way it is, and obviously this is just an example, the next step is using a Vellum PostProcess. Now this is where a lot of the magic is going to happen, and even if you are working with a relatively low poly mesh, you can still get some really nice results using this Vellum PostProcess. So the way that this node works is working in 3 different sections. The first one is the blur. So if I remove all of these, self-collision, detangle, and none, so the blur, it's going to refine a little bit more the simulation. Some areas may be jagged. Obviously, some of the areas you're going to lose the detail. So for example, here you can see how increasing the blur is going to remove that. So it's something to keep in mind, that you may lose some of the detail. Then if necessary, you can add some subdivision. So you have this option to use some subdivision if necessary. Then you have the collision correction. This is extremely useful, in particular when you have some difficult simulations and you have some intersection in some areas. Obviously, keep in mind, this is not going to solve really bad intersections. That's something you'll have to do with a Vellum brush, and I'm going to show you on the other example. But sometimes you have some small intersections and tangles that you can very easily correct it using these two options. And then finally, something I find extremely useful with this tool is the option to add some thickness. And I find this super useful because in different applications you'll have to go and try to extrude in a way that wouldn't intersect. Now, one of the things I wanted to highlight is that this initial thickness is also related with the setting that you have in a vellum cloth, which is this option here, the thickness, edge, length scale. So as you can see, when I go to my vellum cloth, you can see that the thickness that's calculated here, the sphere that you have here, is precisely the thickness that I'm getting. Now, one thing maybe it's important to mention is the fact that you don't want to go with very crazy values here. If you have a very low edge length scale, then you may start to see some intersections with the collision objects you're using. But at the same time, if you use something really big, then the simulation itself is going to play slightly weird. So there is a balance that you want to have, and again, it's something you'll have to play with to find the correct value for you. But as you can see, this is the first option. So just in a nutshell, basically what we do is we let the Vellum Solver to do the hard work for us, to calculate the simulation. You use the Vellum IO to save the simulation, and then once you get to the frame that you want, you can get that into the Vellum Brush. And in the Vellum Brush, you're going to use the input frame to select that frame, and then don't forget set the rest state to make sure you don't have any jumpiness. And then using the different tools that I mentioned here with the Vellum Brush tool, you can just very easily art direct everything into place. This is the first option. Now let me go to the second option. So the second option, remember that we are connecting the Vellum Brush directly to the Vellum cloth. Okay, so now we already know roughly how the tool works. You can straight away start using, for example, let's right click the drag option and start moving things around, just completely fine, for example. But let's say that if you want to do an initial simulation like we did in the Vellum Solver, then if you press the G key, obviously what's going to happen, there is nothing holding this piece of cloth, so it's just going to fall. So one of the things, and what I'm showing here is the workflow that I use in a production environment. One of the things that I do is just reset all changes. Remember that we are able, if we press the shift key, middle mouse button, we can paint some pins. This is going to work as a constraint. So if I paint one here, and if I do the same thing here, then I will press the G key, right? Something like this. This is going to start the calculation. Remember that in terms of quality, we're using 5. Constraint iterations could be higher, but maybe this will be enough. And then what I do is, once I'm happy the way the initial simulation is looking, I don't do anything else on this one. So this is my, as you can see here, initial shape. So after setting up the initial shape, a cool thing that you can do with a Vellum brush is the fact that you can create you can chain together multiple Vellum brush, and they can pick up where you left from the previous one. So in a production environment, you'll have dailies. On those dailies, you get feedback. And sometimes what happens is you're doing, let's say, a cloth simulation like this, and the CG supervisor, the art director, may mention that this section here looks good, but perhaps this one here needs a little bit more work. So the way that I divide is I work into the different sections, and then when I get to a point that I'm happy, I just create a new Vellum brush, and then I work on the other section. This is kind of like creating saving points, and that means that if needed, you can go back to the previous version and just carry on from that point onwards. So that's why I have multiple ones here. And just to show in practice what I mean is, let's say, for example, we are going to, if I increase my gizmo and if I do the control middle mouse, going to remove this, and using right click, drag, let's say, and I'm moving here. It's kind of like, for some reason, what they want. Okay, and let's say, okay, I'm happy how this looks. So now I'm going to the next one. I'm going to reset all changes, right? So I'm going to set rest state. And now I can do the same thing here. I can just remove these pins, and let's say we want to do something like this. Okay, so if you are in dailies and they'll say, you know what, this section here looks good, but this one needs a little bit more work, then very easily you can just reset all changes, right? And you can carry on without affecting this region here. And that's the reason why I like to work with multiple Vellum brushes, so that way it gives me the flexibility to go back and make adjustments and changes. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't mean that you can go back to like the previous one, make adjustments, and they are going to appear on the next Vellum brush. So what I mean is, for example, if I here on this shape A, if I make this kind of adjustment, and then if I go back to my shape A, that adjustment is not going to be visible, obviously. So if I make something like this, and then if I go to my Vellum brush shape B, it's not going to be visible, right? So unfortunately, it would be amazing if the changes that I've made on this one would be visible on this one. They are, but you need to reset all changes back, right? And then you need to start from this position. But still, the fact that you can use the Vellum brush to save different stages is definitely something practical. And then the final step is adding another Vellum brush, and I'm going to do that here. And once you are happy with all the changes and everything, now is the time for you to refine this Vellum, this simulation. So I add another Vellum brush. I just set this as set rest state, and then in terms of quality, I'm going to increase my substeps to 6. And in the brush, then you can start using, for example, the surface, and you can start using the brush mode, for example, and you can start playing around and adding some a little bit more detail. So the idea is you work with those initial Vellum brush just to get the correct shape together, and then you add a final one just to make the final tweaks and adjustments. You have different tools that allow you to do that. So for example, if I use the contract and expand, I have to zoom in for this to be visible. So if I increase the strength to something a bit bigger, this basically does what the tool says, like it contracts or expands. So if I go to this section and if I left click mouse, it starts to contract, and the more you left there, it'll contract. But if you press the control key, it'll do the opposite. It will start to expand. Then you have the other one, which the rotate. If you do it, it'll start rotating on that point. So this is also useful in some situations where perhaps you need to turn this some of the folds. And then you have the crease and ruffle. Perhaps something more like here will be visible, and if I increase, they'll start to create some creases, putting in a specific location. And if I use the control, it'll do the opposite. It'll start to ruffle the cloth. Now you can see that obviously this is a very big piece of cloth, so the detail here it's not going to be amazing. Obviously I'm just showing how it works, but then once you're happy with your results, you can just use the Vellum PostProcess to get the final result. Okay, so basically that's how I do it. Obviously, what you have here is a more simplified version. It gets way more complex than this. Hopefully, the project that I'm working at the moment, once it's public, I can show you where I apply this technique, and I'll make reference to this video to understand exactly what I did. Okay, so I hope you found this tutorial useful. This wasn't scripted, so I probably talk a little bit more than usual. But if something wasn't clear, like I mentioned, you can find this Houdini file on my ArtStation. You can get the link on description. And if you have any questions, just drop a comment in the comment sections and I'll try my best to get back to you. If you have any feedbacks, any suggestions, welcome to that. Ways to improve these kind of tutorials and perhaps making them a little bit shorter than this half an hour one. Well, thanks for watching and goodbye.